Princess Lilibet was standing just inside the ceremonial rope line, watching the changing of the guard, like every other child that day. But then someone stepped too close. They smiled like family, spoke like they knew her, and leaned in with words no 7-year-old should ever hear. Most people thought nothing was wrong. Until Lilibet's hand came up, palm open, thumb tucked, fingers curled, the secret signal. And in the space of a breath, one royal guard broke centuries of protocol. And what he did next stopped the entire courtyard cold. Before we show you exactly what unfolded in those terrifying minutes, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The changing rooms at Wellington Barracks hold a particular kind of quiet before ceremonial duty. It's not silence. Boots still scrape against tile, lockers clang shut, brass buttons click into place. But there's a reverence to it, like putting on armor before battle, except the battlefield is ceremony, and the enemy is anything that might disturb 3 centuries of unbroken tradition. Lance Corporal Leo Marchand rolled his shoulders once, feeling the familiar weight settle across his back as he pulled the scarlet tunic into place. The wool was heavy, perfectly tailored, pristine. Each morning it transformed him from a man into an institution, a living piece of British history that tourists would photograph and children would stare at in wonder. He'd been doing this for 18 months now, ever since the medical board had decided his left lung couldn't handle Afghanistan anymore. 2 collapsed airways and a medical discharge had brought him here, to what some of the lads called toy soldier duty. They meant it as a joke, but Leo saw it differently. This wasn't a step down from combat. It was combat with different rules. Instead of watching for IEDs buried in market squares, he watched for threats hiding in plain sight among crowds of admirers. The transition hadn't been easy. His first month on ceremonial duty, Leo had filed 17 security reports about suspicious behaviour, tourists who lingered too long, photographers who angled their cameras wrong, visitors whose credentials didn't match their accents. His commanding officer had pulled him aside after the 17th report. "Marchand," Major Harwood had said, "you're seeing enemies where there are only sightseers." But Leo's instincts had been vindicated twice. Once, when a supposed journalist's camera bag contained detailed floor plans of Buckingham Palace. Another time, when a lost tourist asking for directions turned out to be conducting surveillance on guard rotations. Both incidents had been quietly handled, never making the papers. But Leo's reputation within the security apparatus had shifted from paranoid ex-combat soldier to the one who sees things others miss. Which was why his name had been specifically requested for today's assignment. High-profile royal appearance, multiple access clearances, the kind of event where threats didn't announce themselves with explosives and gunfire, but with forged credentials and friendly smiles. The bearskin came last, settled with practiced care atop his head. In the mirror, Lance Corporal Leo Marchand disappeared entirely, replaced by something timeless and immovable, just the way it was supposed to be. "Frenchie!" called one of the younger guards, still buttoning his tunic. "You seen the access list for today?" Leo nodded toward his open locker. A single sheet of paper was taped to the inside, temporary clearances for the day's ceremony at St. James's Palace. Most names he recognised. Palace staff, official photographers, the usual rotation of MOD liaisons. But one entry made him pause. Elliot Harrow. Royal Relations. Ground-level access approved. It was the notation underneath that caught his attention. Non-actionable concern flagged via MOD Liaison South. No evidence of threat. Clearance to proceed. In Leo's experience, when intelligence officers wrote non-actionable concern, it usually meant they had a feeling something was off but couldn't prove it. The kind of bureaucratic language that covered backs when things went sideways later. He read the entry twice, then closed the locker with a metallic snap. Across the city, in a drawing room that smelled of rosewater and old wood, Princess Lilibet sat perfectly still while her governess fussed with the hem of her cream-coloured coat. At 7 years old, she understood stillness in a way most children never learn. Not the fidgety restraint of forced good behavior, but the poised calm of someone born to public life. Maya, her American governess, pinned a small brooch just below Lilibet's collar with gentle precision. There we go, Bug, straight as a soldier. But something was different about Lilibet today. Usually she buzzed with questions before these events, about the uniforms, the music, why the guards never smiled. Today she was quiet, thoughtful in a way that seemed older than her years. Her dark eyes kept drifting to the narrow window that overlooked the palace's service paths. "I saw Uncle Elliot earlier," she said suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. Maya's hands stilled on the brooch. "Today? Here at the palace?" Lilibet nodded. "He was talking to someone by the back gate, before breakfast. They had papers spread out on the bonnet of a car." Maya frowned. "What kind of papers?" "Pictures of the palace, of the gates." Lilibet's voice got smaller. "Of me." A chill ran down Maya's spine, but she kept her expression calm. "Honey, photographers take pictures of the palace all the time. And your uncle? Well, he's family. He's allowed to be here." But even as she said it, Maya knew the complications. The bitter custody dispute when Lilibet's parents had divorced. The financial settlements that had left Harrow feeling cheated. The restraining order that had been quietly filed and then just as quietly lifted after pressure from certain family members who valued discretion over safety. "Maybe he just wanted to say hello," Maya continued, though her tone was less certain now. "You haven't seen him in almost 2 years." "Mummy says he only visits when he needs something," Lilibet said matter-of-factly. "She says he measures everything by what it's worth to him." The words carried an adult understanding that shouldn't have existed in a 7-year-old's vocabulary, but royal children learned early that family relationships were often more complicated than love and loyalty. They were currency, leverage, opportunity. "Did he see you watching him?" Maya asked. Lilibet shook her head. "I was careful, but when they finished looking at the papers, he pointed at the window. At my window." The words hung in the perfumed air. Maya knelt down to Lilibet's eye level, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from the girl's sleeve. "Grown-ups can be complicated, Bug, but that doesn't mean he wants to hurt you." Lilibet's small hands gripped the seams of her coat. "I don't want to go out there." "Hey." Maya's voice was warm, reassuring. "You're going to have guards on every side. Big, strong guards who've trained their whole lives to keep you safe. And I'll be right behind you the whole time. Nothing's going to happen. I promise." Lilibet nodded, but the gesture was mechanical. The fear hadn't left her eyes. It had just been pushed down, buried beneath the composure she'd been taught to wear like armor. A soft chime echoed through the corridor. Time to move. As they stepped into the hallway, Maya noticed one small change in Lilibet's behavior. The girl wasn't looking at her shoes anymore, or studying the ornate carpet patterns as she usually did during these walks to public events. Her gaze was alert, scanning, taking in faces and doorways and the spaces between people, like she was watching for something, or someone. The forecourt of St. James's Palace breathed differently than anywhere else in London. Even with hundreds of tourists pressed against the ceremonial barriers, even with the regimental band warming up behind the ancient stone walls, there was something sacred about the space. Sunlight pooled in the corners, where Georgian architecture met modern security, turning everything golden and timeless. The crowd was typical for a Tuesday morning. German tourists with expensive cameras, American families clutching guidebooks, a cluster of Japanese visitors who'd claimed the prime viewing spot hours ago and weren't budging. Everyone pressed forward with that peculiar mix of excitement and reverence you only see at places where history isn't just remembered, but actively performed. In the reserved royal section, separated by polished rope and the quiet presence of protection officers, Princess Lilibet stood with her hands clasped in front of her. Her pale coat caught the morning light. Her dark hair was arranged with mathematical precision, and her posture was flawless. To the casual observer, she looked exactly like what she was, a young royal dutifully attending a ceremonial event. But Leo Marchand, standing at rigid attention near the south gate, noticed what others missed. The way her shoulders sat just a fraction too high, the careful control in her breathing, the fact that her gaze kept returning to the same spot beyond the inner archway. That's where Elliot Harrow stood, having arrived 10 minutes earlier with the easy confidence of someone whose clearance badge had never been questioned. He looked exactly right, tailored grey jacket, polished shoes, the kind of understated elegance that marked him as unmistakably connected to the family he'd been photographed with at christenings and state dinners years earlier. Beside him stood an older man, balding, unremarkable except for the MOD liaison badge pinned to his lapel, though Leo noticed the badge was turned backward, its face hidden against the man's jacket. Small detail, probably meaningless, but in Leo's world, small details were often the only warning you got. What made Leo's instincts sharpen wasn't what the man was doing, but what he wasn't doing. Normal people at ceremonial events looked around constantly, at the guards, the architecture, the pomp and circumstance. This man's gaze was methodical, calculating. He studied sight lines, measured distances, catalogued personnel positions. Leo had seen the same behaviour from spotters in Helmand province, men who memorised patrol routes and timed security rotations. The man pulled out his phone, but instead of taking photos like every other visitor, he appeared to be referencing something already stored on it. Maps, perhaps, or schedules. His thumb scrolled with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing intelligence rather than capturing memories. Then Leo noticed the earpiece. Nearly invisible, flesh-coloured, the kind used by security details or people who needed to communicate without being obvious about it. MOD liaisons carried radios, not covert communication equipment. Leo's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his rifle stock. Two men, with legitimate access credentials, but illegitimate behaviour. One too polished, the other too professional. One playing the part of concerned family member, the other conducting surveillance that had nothing to do with appreciation for British ceremony. Harrow caught Lilibet's eye and smiled, not the broad grin of a delighted uncle, but something more calculated. He raised his hand in a small wave, friendly and disarming. The gesture of someone who belonged there, who had every right to acknowledge his young niece at a public event. Lilibet didn't wave back. Instead, her grip tightened on the folds of her coat, and Leo saw her take a small step backward, closer to her governess. It was subtle, the kind of movement a child might make if they were cold or tired or simply wanted comfort. But Leo had seen enough fear in his life to recognise, even when it was wrapped in royal composure. Something was wrong. Harrow stepped forward then, just to the edge of what was permissible, and called out in a voice designed to carry without attracting unwanted attention. "Lily, darling, come say hello, just for a moment." The tone was perfect, affectionate, casual, the kind of thing any uncle might say to a niece he hadn't seen in months. Maya, focused on watching the band formation, didn't react. Neither did the protection detail, whose attention was trained on the crowd beyond the barriers. But Leo Marchand was watching the wrong things as always. He saw how Harrow's companion touched his lapel once, a subtle gesture that could have been adjusting his jacket but felt more like a signal. He saw how the man's eyes weren't following the ceremony or admiring the pageantry, but instead cataloguing guard positions and measuring distances. Most importantly, he saw Princess Lilibet's reaction. She went very still. Not the practiced stillness of ceremonial duty, but the frozen alertness of prey that knows it's been spotted. Her eyes flicked from Harrow to the man beside him, reading something in their positioning that the adults around her had missed entirely. When she looked across the forecourt and found Leo's gaze, her expression was crystal clear. "Help me." She couldn't say it, couldn't call out or run or do anything that might escalate whatever she sensed building around her. But she had been taught other ways to communicate danger, lessons taught to royal children in quiet rooms, about signals that could save their lives when words weren't possible. Her hand rose slowly, naturally, as if she was simply brushing hair from her face, but the movement continued with deliberate precision. Palm open, thumb tucked, fingers folding over, the universal signal for silent distress. The one they teach in school assemblies and safety briefing. The one that says, "I am in danger and I cannot speak." Leo's breath caught in his chest. Every instinct, honed by 3 tours in Afghanistan, screamed at him to move, to act, to put himself between threat and victim. But 3 centuries of protocol held him frozen in place. Guards didn't break formation. Guards didn't abandon their posts. Guards stood exactly where tradition demanded, no matter what their eyes told them or their conscience demanded. But what happened when duty to tradition conflicted with duty to protection? The crack of boot leather against ancient stone split the morning air like a gunshot. Every head in the forecourt turned at once. Cameras swung toward the sound. Tourists gasped in confusion, and even the regimental band stumbled over a note before recovering their rhythm. In 362 years of ceremonial service, no Coldstream Guard had ever broken formation during active duty. Until now. Lance Corporal Leo Marchand moved with the fluid precision of a soldier whose body responded before his mind finished processing commands. His scarlet tunic blazed against the pale stone as he crossed the ancient courtyard, rifle angled professionally, bearskin casting his face in shadow, but somehow making him more imposing rather than less. His voice cut through the shocked silence with absolute authority. "Step away from the princess." The words weren't shouted, they weren't theatrical, but they carried the weight of someone who'd made peace with consequences before he'd taken his first step. Elliot Harrow turned slowly, and his careful mask of avuncular concern cracked, just enough to show something colder underneath. "Corporal," he said, voice still smooth but with new edges, "what do you think you're doing?" Leo didn't answer. His focus had shifted to the second man, whose hand was moving with deliberate care towards something concealed beneath his jacket. Not fast enough to alarm the civilian observers, but purposeful enough to trigger every combat instinct Leo possessed. He closed the distance in 3 strides and caught the man's wrist before it could disappear beneath the fabric. His other hand pulled back the jacket sharply, revealing a small grey device no larger than a deck of cards, fitted with a mesh receiver and what looked like a pressure switch. "Signal jammer," Leo said quietly, just loud enough for the protection detail now rushing toward them. "Illegal, without authorization." The device would have been capable of blocking short-range communications, radios, earpieces, panic transponders, the kind of equipment that turned organized security into confused chaos, creating windows of opportunity that professional threats knew how to exploit. But as Leo secured the device, he noticed something else. The man's jacket had fallen open completely, revealing not just the jammer, but a detailed diagram taped to the inside pocket. Floor plans. Not of the public areas tourists were allowed to see, but of the private corridors and secure rooms where royal family members waited before public appearances. "Get back!" Harrow snarled, dropping his pretense entirely now. His voice carried new authority, the kind that suggested he'd been giving orders to dangerous people for longer than anyone realized. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." That's when Leo saw the second device. Harrow's hand had moved to his own jacket pocket, and the outline beneath the fabric wasn't a phone or wallet. It was rectangular, with what looked like a small antenna extending from one corner. A transmitter, the kind that could send signals to receivers placed throughout a building. Leo's training kicked in with crystalline clarity. One jammer to block security communications, one transmitter to coordinate with external assets. 2 men with perfect access credentials and imperfect behavior, and a 7-year-old girl who'd been specifically targeted for private conversation away from her protection detail. This wasn't an opportunistic kidnapping. This was a professional extraction, planned down to the equipment and timing, and it was happening in broad daylight in front of hundreds of witnesses, because that was the one place no one would expect it to occur. Security personnel flooded the scene from 3 directions, unsure whether they were responding to protect the princess or arrest the guard who'd just shattered protocol. Commands overlapped, Boots clattered on stone, hands reached for weapons and radios simultaneously. But through it all, Princess Lilibet stood exactly where she'd been, small and composed, watching the controlled chaos unfold around her, with the detached interest of someone who'd just seen her worst fears proven correct. Elliot Harrow finally dropped his pretense entirely. "She's my niece," he said flatly. "I was cleared to be here. This guard is creating a scene over nothing." Leo's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. She gave the distress signal. The words hit like stones thrown into still water, spreading ripples of understanding through everyone within earshot. Harrow's face went blank. The protection detail stopped moving. Even the tourists pressing against the barriers seemed to sense that something fundamental had just shifted. "What signal?" Harrow demanded. The answer came from behind Leo, in a voice that was quiet but perfectly clear. "He told me not to tell anyone what he was going to say to me." Princess Lilibet stepped forward slightly, her chin raised, no longer hiding behind her governess or the protection detail. "He said it would be our secret, but Mummy taught me, if you feel scared and you can't say why, you make the sign." She demonstrated the gesture with precise execution. Palm open, thumb tucked, fingers curled. "I made it so the guard could see," she continued, looking directly at Leo, "because he was watching me. Really watching, not just looking." The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition. The kind that rewrites rules in real time and makes 3 centuries of protocol suddenly seem less important than a 7-year-old girl's instincts about danger. The aftermath unfolded with bureaucratic efficiency. The signal jammer was logged as evidence. The second man, whose visitor credentials turned out to be cloned from a 6-week-old clearance, was quietly removed from the premises without fanfare. Elliot Harrow's access badge was revoked on the spot. His name added to a register that didn't officially exist, but that would follow him for the rest of his life. But the investigation that followed revealed the true scope of what Leo had interrupted. The transmitter in Harrow's pocket was connected to a network that extended far beyond the palace grounds. Technical analysis found signals bouncing to 3 different locations across London: a rented van parked 2 blocks away, a hotel room overlooking the Thames, and a private airfield in Essex, where a charter plane sat fueled and ready for immediate departure. The floor plans hidden in the accomplice's jacket weren't just reconnaissance, they were marked with specific routes, timing notations, and exit strategies. Someone had spent months studying palace security protocols, guard rotations, and the precise schedules of royal family members. Most disturbing of all were the financial records uncovered during the expanded investigation. Bank transfers from overseas accounts, payments structured to avoid detection, and communications with individuals whose names appeared on international watch lists. This hadn't been about family grievances or custody disputes. It had been about money, specifically the kind of money that certain governments and private entities were willing to pay for access to British royal children. The scope was so serious that counterintelligence services were quietly brought in. Phone records were seized, financial assets were frozen. A broader network was mapped and systematically dismantled over the following weeks. None of it made the papers. The palace issued no statements. But within the security apparatus, the incident became a case study in how close professional threats could get when they understood the system well enough to exploit its assumptions about family, tradition, and trust. No charges were filed, no arrests made, no statements issued to the press. The ceremony resumed within the hour, the band playing the same ancient melodies they'd performed for generations. Tourists went back to taking pictures and checking guidebooks. The guards rotated on schedule, maintaining the timeless precision that made the whole spectacle feel eternal rather than fragile. But in a wood-panelled room deep inside the palace, Lance Corporal Leo Marchand stood at attention before a review board that would determine whether his breach of protocol had been justified or merely destructive. Major Christopher Harwood, MOD liaison to Royal Security, sat across from him with 2 officials from Internal Review. The silence stretched long enough to make most people uncomfortable, but Leo had learned patience in places where fidgeting could get you killed. "You understand why we're here?" Harwood finally said. Yes, sir. You abandoned your post during active ceremonial duty. Yes, sir. You intervened in a situation involving a member of the royal family without command authorization. Yes, sir. Harwood leaned back slightly. Now tell me why. Because Princess Lilibet gave the distress signal, and I was the only one watching her closely enough to see it. One of the review officials frowned. She's 7 years old. How can you be certain she understood the gravity of... She understood enough to signal for help, Leo interrupted quietly, and I understood enough to respond. The door opened then, and Maya entered with Princess Lilibet at her side. No one had summoned them, but they'd come anyway, the governess looking protective, the princess looking determined in a way that seemed far too adult for her small frame. Your Highness, Major Harwood said gently, this is a formal review. You don't need to be here. Yes, I do, Lilibet replied with the kind of quiet authority that reminded everyone present exactly whose bloodline she carried. She walked to Leo's side and looked up at the review board with steady eyes. He saw my signal, she said clearly. I did what Mummy taught me when someone makes you scared and you can't say why. He was the only one looking at me like I mattered. She turned to Leo. Thank you for seeing me. The words carried weight that had nothing to do with her age or title. They were the acknowledgement of one person to another. Someone who'd been in danger recognizing someone who'd chosen to help, regardless of consequences. Major Harwood cleared his throat. The technical analysis confirms the device was a signal suppressor. No legitimate reason for it to be on palace grounds. The bearer's credentials were fraudulent. He looked directly at Leo. Your assessment appears to have been correct. Sir, there will be questions, reviews, probably some uncomfortable conversations with people who care more about precedent than they do about protection. Harwood's expression softened almost imperceptibly. But the regiment stands behind your decision. That evening, Leo returned to his quarters at Wellington Barracks as the sun settled low over London. Word had travelled through the military community with the speed that news always does when protocol gets shattered for the right. Brother guardsmen nodded their approval as he passed. Officers who'd spent careers upholding tradition offered quiet words of support for his choice to break it when breaking it mattered. In his small room, Leo found an envelope that had been slipped under his door. Inside was a sheet of palace stationery with a drawing executed in coloured pencils, a guardsman in a bearskin hat, standing protectively in front of a small figure in a cream coat. At the bottom, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, "Thank you for listening when I couldn't talk." He pinned it to the wall beside his bed, next to commendations from Afghanistan and photographs of brothers-in-arms who hadn't made it home. Different wars, different threats, but the same fundamental duty, standing between danger and those who needed protection. 3 weeks later, Princess Lilibet attended another ceremony at St. James's Palace. This time, she stood in the royal section with quiet confidence, watching the guards with focused attention, but without the hidden tension that had marked her previous visit. Leo was there too, back at his post, rifle precisely angled, bare skin casting his face in ceremonial shadow. To the tourists pressed against the barriers, he looked exactly like what they expected, an immovable monument to British tradition and military discipline. But when his eyes met Lilibet's across the forecourt, something passed between them that had nothing to do with ceremony or protocol. She touched her heart once, briefly. A small gesture of acknowledgement. His response was nearly invisible, just the slightest inclination of his head. The understanding between them was simple. Sometimes the greatest act of service isn't following orders, but knowing when to break them. What no one else in the crowd could see was how Lilibet's behaviour had changed since that day. She stood differently now, more aware, more confident. Her governess had mentioned it during the security briefing. The princess was asking different questions about the people around her, paying attention to details that 7-year-olds normally overlooked. She was learning to see what Leo saw, to watch for the wrong things in the right places, to trust her instincts, even when they conflicted with what adults told her was safe. And Leo, for his part, had found new purpose in the ceremonial role he'd once seen as exile from real soldiering. Every public appearance now carried weight. Every crowd contained potential threats that only his trained eye could detect. Every royal child who attended these events was someone's daughter, someone's future, someone who deserved protection that went beyond the rigid boundaries of protocol. After the ceremony concluded and the crowds dispersed, Leo noticed a small commotion near the palace gates. A man with a camera had been stopped by security. Nothing unusual except for the way he'd been positioned to photograph not the ceremony, but the access points and guard rotations. His credentials checked out. His story was plausible. But something about his behavior triggered the same instincts that had served Leo well before. The man was quietly escorted away, his memory card confiscated, his press credentials flagged for additional scrutiny. Later investigation would reveal connections to the same overseas accounts that had funded Harrow's operation. The network was still active, still probing, still looking for weaknesses in the system that protected Britain's most vulnerable targets. But now they had Lance Corporal Leo Marchand watching back. And he'd learned that the most important battles weren't always the ones that made headlines. Sometimes they were the quiet victories that no one ever heard about, fought by people willing to risk everything to protect a child's right to grow up safe. The ceremony continued with its ancient rhythms. The band played music that had echoed off these stones for centuries. Guards moved through formations perfected by generations of soldiers. Tourists captured moments of pageantry that would fill albums and social media feeds around the world. But everyone present understood they were witnessing something more than performance. They were seeing the continuation of something living, a tradition that bent when it needed to, that prioritized protection over protocol when a child's safety hung in the balance. And in the reserved royal section, a 7-year-old princess watched with the knowledge that she'd learned something invaluable about courage. Not the loud, obvious kind that gets medals and headlines, but the quiet type that recognizes a silent plea for help and acts on it, consequences be damned. Would you have seen that signal? Would you have recognized it for what it was? A child's desperate attempt to communicate danger when words weren't safe. And do you think Lance Corporal Marchand was right to shatter 3 centuries of protocol the moment he saw Princess Lilibet's silent cry for help? Sometimes courage whispers instead of shouts. Sometimes it's a 7-year-old girl making a secret signal when speaking could make things worse. Sometimes it's a soldier choosing humanity over tradition when tradition isn't enough. If this story moved you, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe with notifications on so you never miss our daily uploads. Share this with someone who needs to remember that the right choice isn't always the obvious choice, and that real heroes are the ones who act when everyone else is just watching. Your next Royal Guard story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves sometimes breaking the rules is the most honourable thing you can do.